It's Sunday, KMBest Marvel Snap Top Decks Day. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. And there is an elephant in the room. Or should I say a dragon. Now, Shou-Lao has been a very powerful card in the first week of its release. The card has been extremely prominent in the high-level metagame, and generally, we have been working to figure out what the Shou-Lao deck really looks like. The card is strong enough that it sort of redefines what your incentives are. Rather than just going in a werewolf deck, it suddenly becomes a little more clear that the way to build around Shou-Lao is to build around Shou-Lao as your enabler. Now, the best things to do with a big buff in Marvel Snap are to make that buff have double its impact. Cards like Maverick and Scarlet Spider are the best ways to do this with Shou-Lao. Now, what this card does is extremely strong, but it's also set up well to tackle a couple of the normal problems decks like this face, which makes it feel, I think, a little bit stronger than it actually is, which is not to say that it's not one of, if not the best decks in the game. This is a deck that is actually uniquely set up to beat Shadow King decks. One of the things that Shou-Lao can do is output a very small amount of points into a very limited lane and throw priority better than basically any Shadow King deck can. In addition, if you accomplish this, not only does their Shadow King have no target, but even their game planning for Shadow King on turn 6 means that they won't be able to output nearly as many points as you will. They're using a 3-4 to try to cancel out your 5-8 plus some other stuff. You actually generally come out ahead in those spots, even when it does happen, because you're splitting the buff across multiple locations on a body that is a 5-8. That means that what this deck is perfectly set up to do is attack the meta that was. A lot of decks that were very good with specific Shadow King-y builds are now very bad because that card doesn't address this threat in a meaningful way. So not only is this a card that outputs a lot of power, it outputs it in a way that bypasses a lot of the natural defenses that decks have built up over the last few weeks. To put it another way, there's a bit of a scar tissue effect going on where players just aren't used to moving in the way that is required to beat Shou-Lao decks. The card I think this compares the most correctly to is Invisible Woman First Steps on release. It comes out, it is incredibly powerful, and not only is it a lot of numbers, it is also a lot of numbers that are interacting with the counters to those numbers in ways that are not favorable to those counters, necessitating a metagame change to move a different direction. That's not to say, again, that this deck isn't very good. It is very good. But I also think that this actually does just need a little bit of time to percolate before we start talking about how we have to nuke this card into oblivion. I remember Invisible Woman First Steps. She lost 2 points of power. She is now an extremely balanced card. That's obviously not the only thing that happened to her, but what you really want to avoid in this situation, if you're the player base, and I think if you're second dinner, is obliterating this card before we actually figure out what to play against it. And before we even get to that, we have to talk about what we're supposed to do with the card. There are still so many options in the air. There are a bunch of different ways to build this card. We all know it's powerful. We all know what the baseline core is, the Maverick stuff, the Scarlet Spider stuff, and we know that there are ways to try to build to beat that. Are those ways going to be allowed to exist? How many points is this deck actually? I think a lot of people are going to look at the Snowball Showdown and say, look how busted this card is. But there were a couple of archetypes, combo style archetypes, that you would expect to have a pretty good interaction into a deck that is just points and no tech, that weren't able to be played because of the deck building restrictions in there. In addition, several of the Shou-Laos in the top 16 were only in there because of the deck building restrictions. I talked to Andre Var. He didn't want to play Shou-Lao in his V-hand deck. He had to do it. I talked to Cougar. He didn't want to play Shou-Lao in the Batroc deck. He had to do it. That's how the deck building in that situation works. But there are no deck building restrictions on Ladder. So largely my take is, I think this is a really good deck. I would not be surprised if Shou-Lao ate a nerf, but I also don't think it's nearly as unbeatable as people seem willing to act like it is. This deck is obscenely powerful, and people just don't seem to be willing to give it the credit that it deserves. Cougar's build of this does not want to play Shou-Lao. You're going to see people talking about the Snowball Showdown top 2 finish from Cougar with the Shou-Lao in here. I talked with both Cougar and Iris, who worked together on making this deck for this tournament. The only way they were allowed to bring this deck was if they put Shou-Lao in it because of the deck building restrictions. Consistently, they said they would much rather be playing a Hellion in here. This is the list they would have played if there were no deck building restrictions, and he finished second place with a, let's be honest about this, worse version of the deck in a field of immense amounts of Shou-Lao. This deck is good, and it can absolutely compete on the same tier as what people are talking about with Big SL. This is a powerful list that has a ton of inbuilt synergy and is getting a card next week that looks extremely useful in this archetype, Lin Lie. And this is a really strong deck already. The biggest downside this deck has, fundamentally, compared to a Shou-Lao deck, is that Shou-Lao pretty much instructs you how to play. It's a lot easier to play. You make sure you're doing what he asks you to do, you make the last card you play a Scarlet Spider, and then you play the Shou-Lao. This deck is much more difficult, but when you actually invest into a deck, the amount of reward you can get from learning an archetype like this is genuinely massive. I cannot say enough good things about this deck. I know there are a type of player who likes looking for a deck to sit in and master. This deck has been good since Invisible Woman first steps. Some version of this kind of thing has been around since that time. It is very good. It will consistently remain very good. It is able to compete with everything the metagame has thrown at it, including and up to Shou-Lao. Another one that I think is just consistently getting underrated is an easy points package with an easy tech slot in. Now, the Super Adaptoid, a little bit speculative. Like I said, I talked to Andre Var. It was originally a rogue, but he was thinking about trying a Super Adaptoid. I did try it, and it does make that matchup really free. The problem is, in order to make that happen, you need to make sure you take priority, and also you kind of hope they don't know about it. But if you are able to do this to their Scarlet Spider, you win the game. Like, you just absolutely win the game. A lot of the Shou-Lao decks are predicated on these activate, on board, I'm going to use this to double the impact of my Shou-Lao cards, Scarlet Spider and Maverick. In the doing of that, they are often behind on priority, which means that Super Adaptoid puts them in a dumpster. I know that's a weird thing to say, but V-Hand's strength has always been adaptability. This is always a deck where it's like, all right, well, if there's like one or two really important tech cards and they're cheap enough, we can play them. What you lose here is wide coverage, right? Shadow King still covers a lot of stuff, and I'm not sure how much Shou-Lao with the Scarlet Spider stuff has really percolated downwards. I can't speak to that because I don't know. This deck is really good against Shou-Lao. Like, I'm not gonna lie to you. If you do basically anything and then turn their combo off, you can math out the entire rest of the game, and you're probably gonna win it. That kind of stuff is just a really good space for a deck like this to be in. It's just a strong, powerful, mid-rangey deck that has both Deafening Chord and Super Adaptoid to get rid of things that are normally going to go over the top of it. These are the kinds of decks that did it in for Invisible Woman in the first place. And I think, you know, obviously the comparison might be getting a little stretched here, but I do think I generally feel like the discourse on Shou-Lao has gotten a bit hyperbolic, and we should maybe try figuring out what the best deck for the card is first, and then figuring out if we can beat that before we start talking about how we have to get rid of this card. Because there are a couple decks in terms of going really tall that Shou-Lao can just never, ever actually beat in a billion, trillion, bazillion years. Another, I guess, combination of old and new school deck that I think people are really overlooking in their haste to be like, ooh, let's play the new hotness of Shou-Lao is Gamer's build of Butt's build of Galactus C3. This is a list that kind of burst onto the scene fairly recently. It combines a very immense threat of a gigantically Jocasta Maverick Galactus with the consistent and strong power output of C3. Now, I will take this time to note, I also think C3 is still really good. Like, we can talk about various things in this space, but just base C3 is still a whole bunch of points, and you can play stuff like Valkyrie that is quite good against some of the things you're gonna be seeing. I think there's merit to not being a Galactus deck here, but I also think that this deck is another deck that simply is not getting the respect it deserves. You look at this, and you're like, wow, they put two terrible decks together. The thing is, it does work. You mostly just play a C3 game plan, and then sometimes you're able to threaten your opponent by dropping a gigantic Galactus on them that they have to respect. And if they don't respect it and you have your Jocasta Maverick stuff, you can do some really dumb stuff. But the backbone of this deck is just that Cerebro 3 outputs a whole lot of points. Shou-Lao invests a lot in making like a 20 power Scarlet Spider. That's really good. And they also have the 8 power body from Shou-Lao, but they don't really get into like the 40s or high 30s range of points. And you can. And that kind of stuff is really valuable. I'm not saying this is necessarily the exact right build of C3 going forward. I think the threat of Galactus gives you some free wins, but I wouldn't be surprised if I saw maybe a more interactive build of Cerebro 3 doing well going forward. The point I'm making here is, if you're looking for stuff that can compete, there's another card that gives a lot of +3s to your board. I'm not sure how much life Ramp actually has in it as a method of dealing with this kind of stuff, but Cosmic Ghost Rider is very much worth name checking here, because until people start respecting Cosmic Ghost Rider, and I want to be super clear, if you think you are playing against a Ramp deck and you are playing a deck with activates in it, don't put them in the front row. I don't care what you say to me in response. Don't let them Cosmic Ghost Rider you. That's your entire deck. They will beat your ass if they blow up your Man Spider. They will beat your ass if they blow up your Jocasta even. They are on it. This deck does need to stop the Shou-Lao stuff from happening in order to really have access to all of the power that it wants. But even so, its nut draws are good enough that you can just position in a way that you might be able to beat the Shou-Lao draw some of those times as well. I'm not sure how much life this deck has in it. I think this deck is largely the biggest casualty of the Shou-Lao stuff, because when you're able to duplicate Shou-Lao's buff, you are mostly outpointing this. The saving grace is that all of the really good ways to duplicate Shou-Lao's buff are vulnerable to a Cosmic Ghost Rider, and you do actually have to respect that. So that is the main dynamic in that matchup, whereas every other matchup for Ramp is basically the same as it's always been. It's just a really good deck with really good interaction that fills the consistent point and tech output spot in this metagame. I think it is a very solid deck, and whether or not it remains so depends on, frankly, on how many people start realizing what they have to do to dodge Cosmic Ghost Rider. Mr. Negative is in a weird spot where it can go obscenely tall and beat the living crap out of basically anything in the game right now, but I really do want to highlight how good it is against Shou-Lao. Notably, this is a deck that Shou-Lao's a great card. Gore and Iron Man are better, and Gore is actually pretty good in that matchup. There are just a lot of things going on here that push against it. The first is the negative, like, fundamental profile, which is to say, this is a deck that doesn't always work. And I realize you look at Shou-Lao and you're like, well, that deck doesn't always work, but there's 75% chance to draw their Shou-Lao. You need your Mr. Negative as early as you could possibly get it. Another thing pushing against you is the Shou-Lao decks are basically all Merlin decks correctly, and you kind of have to respect that if you're going to try to be a Magic deck, which puts you in really awkward situations. It's very hard to be a Magic deck right now because of all the potential omniversal presences. Not that it's impossible, but it does make this deck notably worse. This is a deck, though, that if you do your thing, they are dead. Full stop. End of story. Shou-Lao does not outpoint this. Even in some games where they don't do their thing, you can still beat them. That is the level of power that we're talking about some of the time here. It's a very reasonable deck right now. I think that a lot of the things that people are looking at Shou-Lao at, they're looking at it and they're saying, well, this is a bunch of points and it's beating all the mid-range decks. And I believe that's true, but there are other decks than mid-range decks in the game. Another way to try to target it could be with Man Spider. You'll notice that there's no SK in my Shou-Lao deck, because the sort of prominent dynamic of Shou-Lao mirrors is if you're SKing, you're losing anyway. You don't really want to be doing that. You want to be going points for points or interacting in a different way. That's just not how you win Shou-Lao mirrors, is with SK. You don't do that way. So this is a bit more speculative, but I kind of think that a lot of what I'm seeing in the metagame right now is telling me to play a little bit less SK. I don't know that that's going to percolate downwards. But what I will tell you is if people stop playing SK, this deck is going to beat people's faces in. This is a deck that I've talked about in the past where it's just like, this deck is actually legitimately good right now in the most SK heavy metagames we've ever been in. What happens when we're not in those? And I'm just like sort of raising the siren right now of we could be moving into a non-SK heavy metagame because of the way Shou-Lao interacts with that card so profitably for the Shou-Lao player and so unprofitably for the SK player. Which leads me to believe that it is very possible that this deck could be a very good choice. Now, the downside here, though, is if you go back and look at my Shou-Lao deck from the front of the video, I am going to play Cosmo, and I'm going to play Cosmo largely out of deference to things like Deafening Chord and Super Adaptoid in my Maverick and Scarlet Spider lane, but it'll also beat this stuff too. Another thing to pay attention to is if people start adapting Super Adaptoid, then you might not be able to maintain priority well enough to make sure that your gigantic symbiote Spider-Man actually happens. All of that, real concern. But if those things don't happen to you, you kind of just win the game. And that's real. I actually quite like the Invisible Win First Steps deck right now. It's just a nice little fun thing to do. I'm not going to make any arguments as to like whether or not it makes sense. And frankly, I think a lot of the reasons that I gave for why I think the Man Spider deck will be good going forward apply negatively to this, where it's like, all right, if you're playing a bunch of Super Adaptoid, a bunch of Deafening Chord stuff, you don't want to see that. But I have been shockingly impressed by this deck's point output. Like, legitimately, just kind of a lot going on here that is doing points in really powerful ways. And just having all of these options available to you, all of these different cards that all say end of turn. We finally have like mostly good cards in this deck. Adam Warlock, give or take. I think you could pretty much argue he's a bad card, but not having to run Bruce Banner anymore. Do you have any idea how freeing it is to put a fantastic card in your deck and not look at 7 of the cards in here and be like, God, I wish we had actual cards that we could run there instead? It is very freeing. And I'm just sort of pointing out this archetype is getting better and better, legitimately. A very underrated deck, in my opinion. I think Ongoing might be the game's best kept secret. There's just very little to complain about with this archetype. It's just sort of consistently been a good thing. There are a couple of arguments you want to make. I think it's very reasonable to play Captain Carter over Mr. Fantastic because you really want to go points for points with the show decks, and Captain Carter is much better at doing that. I think that's a very reasonable swap to make. I think I might end up making it, but I haven't played any games with it, so I don't want to put that on here without having done that. I think this is a very solid list that maybe it's not at the apex of tier 1, but I think if you really spend time with this list, you will find that it consistently is able to match points for points with almost anything reasonable in the game. It is a list that I often come back to in metagames like this, when there are sort of undefined levels of points running around, and I just want something that's going to be able to like X4 on my Mystique. That's when this deck tends to excel. I have really appreciated this deck in similar metagames. If it weren't a Magic deck, I'd almost call this deck legitimately very strong. Like, Zombie Galacti is a very reasonable card right now. I know it's kind of a shock to see it on the tier list. Jayawala hit rank 1 with it. It's honestly kind of nice. This is not like, oh my god, it's so super incredibly busted, but we are at a point where I think we can conclusively say that after the buff, after Maverick, after the other help that this card has gotten recently, it's just a good card. It's not like the greatest build around in the world, but it's at least living tribunal level, in my opinion, and arguably, I would say, above that. And that's something that I don't think people have acknowledged at this point in Marvel Snap. I think people are just expecting it to be like, just this is the worst build around in the game. It's at least as good as Living Tribunal. I think it's a little bit better. I think this is a legitimate deck. The only real question for it is, are you getting outpointed by Shou-Lao stuff? Because obviously you're not an interactive deck, and some RNG is involved in actually getting to your output. So you could conceivably get outpointed by really good Shou-Lao draws. You're also vulnerable to everything a Magic deck is vulnerable to. but this is not nearly the deck other people think it is. I want to cut back to Shou-Lao here for a second, because I've talked a lot about how we don't actually know what the best thing to be doing with him is. I think it's very confident. I can very confidently say, like, the dominant mode of Shou-Lao right now is the spider stuff, but it's not the only thing you can be doing in this space. I want to highlight this list from Honifer that is built around, instead of being an on-board Shou-Lao deck, multiplying Shou-Laos, winning Maverick mirrors with Shou-Laos, i.e. copying it with White Queen, stealing it with Cable, grandmastering your Shou-Lao, multiplying the deck, multiplying the effect of the card more from hand than from deck. That is actually the sort of basic ethos here. Is like, if you're going to play against a bunch of Shou-Lao stuff, and I especially really want to give a shout out to Cable, who I desperately want to get into the deck that I put at the beginning of this video. I want him in there so bad. But I can't, like, I have to cut Iceman to get him in there, and it's just like, oh, do I really want to do that? But I really want him in there. Anyway, largely, the point being made here is what this deck is doing that I think is so unique and so strong is to put itself in a position to duplicate Shou-Lao in a way that dodges mostly things like Deafening Chord, because you're not going to be as obviously on the board. It dodges people adapting like with Super Adaptoid. It dodges most of the things people are going to be doing. You're duplicating the impact of Shou-Lao with cards like Grandmaster and their Shou-Lao. That kind of stuff is more interesting to me based on being a deck that operates from hand. I think that is a reasonable thing to take this deck in the future. Prodigy, Grandmaster, duplicating Shou-Lao, there's something there. Part of the cards is Surfer. Shou-Lao is leaning into the typical Surfer thing. This is a similar build to sort of Surfer Jocasta stuff, where the idea is basically you take something that's already good, which is, you know, Maverick and Shou-Lao, and you fuse that into a Surfer deck so your floor is higher. Your floor in games that you don't draw Shou-Lao is a good Surfer deck, whereas your floor in other decks when they don't draw Shou-Lao is basically doing nothing. And I think that's a reasonable way to try to build this list. There are a lot of cool things that this deck is doing. There's a lot of points in it. There's a lot of solid output. There's obviously a solid Shou-Lao combo in there, but you are giving up the spider in order to get your baseline game plan in there. It is a little bit more difficult to always make work. There are some really strong things this deck can do, and there are some slightly less strong things this deck can do. But until you have, for example, Shou-Lao on 5, with Hope Summers allowing you to play multiple cards, onto your Maverick, that then enables you to make a brood that is approximately 75 million power, don't talk to me about this deck. Until you've done that, get back to me after you've done it, okay? This list of Phantom X, piloted by Quick Status, did a very solid performance it made it into the top 16 of the Snowball Showdown in a gauntlet of Shou-Laos, effectively. What I really want to highlight about this card, or about this deck, there are 3 cards that I really want to highlight specifically that I think are all worth talking about in the context of what Shou-Lao is becoming. The first is Cable, the second is Copycat, and the third is Lady Deathstrike. Cable and Copycat are kind of doing the same things, but if you are playing a sort of good stuff-ish mid-range deck, those are the kind of cards you're going to want to jam in here. They are very good at making sure you know whether or not you have to worry about a Shou-Lao or not. The other card, Lady Deathstrike, blows up Mavericks that aren't pre-buffed. They care quite a bit about that. There was a game against Heart of the Cards' Surfer Shou-Lao list where there were literally 0 cards on Heart's side by the time turn 6 started to resolve. It was an unbelievable thing to happen, but this deck can do it, especially because so many decks of this Shou-Lao style are just stacking one lane because they really don't want priority. Oh no, I really hope you don't blow up my Jocasta Maverick lane. I'm going to blow up your Jocasta Maverick lane. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.